I think it'll feel like a very dark, maybe at times incoherent fever dream, which is what the experience felt like. So honestly, when people say that to me, I'm like, yeah, like I understand. Like, this is not the insult that you think it is. That's exactly what I was going for.
Welcome to the Skiffy and Fanny Show.
I've buried countless bodies in my mouth. Their screams blackberry cobbler, a cold sugared tea.
It's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
It's a good line.
One of my favorite
I'm
lines.
Sean.
I'm Brandon.
I'm Trish.
And today we're joined by the, and it is written here, as I'm about to say it, bewitchingly macabre writer and editor Stephanie M. Wytovich, author of the novel The Eighth and numerous poetry collections, including the Bram Stoker Award-winning brothel sheet music to My Acoustic Nightmare and The Apocalyptic Mannequin. What a title that one is. Apocalyptic Mannequin. My lord. That sounds terrifying. I've seen the movie Mannequin, just to be clear, and that the idea that the mannequin is not Kim Cattrall and would be murdering people is terrifying to me.
It should be.
It should be. A member of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Poetry Association and the Horror Writers Association, Stephanie's latest poetry collection, today's subject, On the Subject of Blackberries, is now available from Raw Dog Screaming Press. Welcome to the show, Stephanie.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Us too. This is going to be interesting. This is, I think, our first true poetry interview, other than when I interviewed Brandon, but that doesn't really count because Brandon's my friend. So
yeah, I wasn't here in my capacity as a poet. I was here in my capacity as someone who loves Sean very much.
Well, we have a friendly reminder. Before we get to wonderful questions for Stephanie, we want to hear from you, the listeners. Please share your comments with us about this and past episodes at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. We want to put together a listener mailbag episode with your thoughts, questions, topic suggestions, and more, so get those thoughts in.
Or else the apocalyptic mannequins will come for you.
They will.
That's right.
They will.
That's actually the worst threat I think I've ever made on this show. That's a terrifying idea. Okay, so Stephanie, let's start with the basic question. Can you tell us a little bit about On the Subject of Blackberries?
Yeah. So, I mean, not to start us off on like a somewhat depressing note, but this collection was quite literally born out of my experience with postpartum depression. So I had my first child and my only child in January of 2022. And about 3 months after her birth, I really started kind of going through it. I had tried to get help from a couple different places, and nobody really kind of came through for me, which was frustrating on a number of levels. And so I kind of fell back into what I knew had always helped me when I was struggling with anything with mental health, and that was writing and writing poetry specifically. This collection wasn't something that I initially even planned to publish because it is so vulnerable and so incredibly, incredibly intimate, as is the story behind how it kind of came to be. But the more that I kind of thought about it, I feel like postpartum in general is often treated that way. And I didn't want to contribute to that narrative of secrecy. So I thought, if this helped me, then maybe other women who are kind of going through this, or if anybody's struggling with anything mental health wise, they can kind of see poetry and writing and maybe art in general just as a creative outlet that can kind of provide some catharsis. So that was kind of how things kind of naturally formed. And then they got progressively more witchy and, and dark the more that I started like getting into it and really starting to kind of find the fun in creating the collection, and rather than just kind of using it as a method to heal.
So the first question I actually wanted to ask about this is more of a selfish question for me,
Okay.
because I think we're going to get into some of the ways that the poetry is dealing with very personalized subjects, because I think there's some great images in here. But I have long said that poetry is not my strongest area of literary understanding. And so I was curious about kind of how you approach when you sit down to sort of write a poem. What is that approach like for you? Or is it many different approaches? What does it look like when you start putting those words to the page?
So the process for this book was unlike anything I had ever done before. Usually when I'm writing, I, like most writers, I carry a notebook with me, and like if I see something interesting or a phrase or something like pops into my head, I take notes, and sometimes I kind of puzzle them together, and just, when I'm sitting down at my desk for my writing time, I make something out of nothing. But for this one particularly, so Shirley Jackson's We Have Always Lived in the Castle is my comfort book, which for anybody who's read it might be kind of terrifying to hear somebody say that out loud. But it is. I love it deeply. I read it often. And I was really having a hard time. Like, I was watching a lot of true crime, which was certainly not helping my mental state. Like, I couldn't, like, I would start reading horror novels, and like I would stop. Like, I couldn't, nothing was bringing me joy. Like, the stuff that I usually would turn to for entertainment, like, wasn't working. And so I picked up my comfort read and I started reading it, and I started thinking about Shirley Jackson's life, and um how her troubles and struggles when she was raising kids. I read her biography by Ruth Franklin a couple years ago, and I used her book as kind of, I don't want to say like a portal, but I kind of started puzzling things that I saw in myself that I was going through, and things that I saw in Mary Cat and Constance. And I would go through the book and I would do different rituals. And I would, like, if you open the copy of the book I have, there are words circled and there's lines, like it looks like a murder board. Like when the like the cops are like, all it's missing is the red thread. And it looks like, somebody was really trying to solve a mystery. And it was really just kind of me finding comfort in realizing that somebody else has thought about something dark and scary and intrusive, and found comfort in rituals. And so I kind of inserted myself into the book, and it's a very strange, it's hard to explain. But yeah, so I spent a lot of time. I went chapter by chapter. I rewrite everything. I picked out my favorite words. I wrote them in a separate book, and then I thought about what those words meant to me. And I would kind of build stuff out from there. It was a very unique, strange way to write a book, but I have to admit that I really, really loved it. It was a lot of fun, and I hope I can do it again, maybe in a different frame of mind, but something similar for sure.
So you'd mentioned at the beginning of that, and I wanted to come back to it, that you like would write down little things that you like little lines and things like that. And I remember listening to an interview with Eminem, or watching an interview with Eminem once, where he just like brings out this box of just little slips of paper where he's written just any random rhyme or line.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that kind of you too? Maybe not a box per se. Okay.
Very much so. Yep. I have a whole bunch of journals. I have sketchbooks. I have envelopes. Like, I am, and it's funny because I'm a very organized person in like real life, but when it comes to my art, like it is chaos, like through and through, beginning to end.
So then, like, okay, follow up then. Sorry, I'm going to ask lots of questions I have so many questions. So like, you're reading Shirley Jackson, and you're like, oh, this was really cool, or like, and then you're writing down little pieces and stuff and ideas. At what point do you go, that little snippet that I came up with, I'm going to insert that here, and then I'm going to kind of figure out the pieces that go around? Or like, where does it go from these snippets of moments to becoming something basically a full poem?
Yeah, so I've written a little bit, not to get too like woo-woo magical kind of with this, but I've written a little bit about kind of how I like to look at poetry almost as like a form of conjure, in a way,
Oh.
where like if I know I'm going to sit down and write. Like when I would actually really like sit down and I'm like, all right, I'm going to start piecing and putting the puzzle together. Like I usually have to listen to some type of music, and it's usually dark and ambient and atmospheric and makes everybody in my house very uncomfortable because it's very loud and it's like what's happening in this room. And then I really honestly I like to free write a lot. Like I usually set timers and I'll write for, a couple minutes, or I'll type for a little bit. I won't look at what's on the computer, or I'll try not to. Like if I'm on my laptop, I'll put the screen down so I can't like self edit or correct or anything like that. And I like to kind of see what comes out naturally when I'm not critiquing myself or holding back, or like I'm not seeing myself be vulnerable. So it's easier to be vulnerable. And that's usually when some of the darkest stuff comes out. And I have to do it like that, or else I can't access that type of intimacy. And I always tell people like I feel like I had to write 4 poetry collections that look like horror books, because they are horror books. But like sheet music was the first time that I started letting people see into me a little bit, because I greatly, greatly admire confessional poets and I greatly admire horror. And that was my goal, was I wanted to kind of merge both of them and kind of show people what that looked like. But it's very scary to do that. And it took me a long time to kind of build up like the confidence and the authenticity in a way where I felt like I could do that. So I feel like sheet music was my first attempt at that. And then Blackberries, I feel like, is when I finally got it right.
I'm glad you raised the horror issue here, because that's the last general question before we talk very particular about the book, because you're obviously writing what has broadly been referred to as speculative poetry. And while I suspect some of our listeners are aware of what that is, there may be some confusion, like what makes poetry speculative? Mm-hmm. Because you mentioned like the confessional poets, and I think a lot of people perceive poetry as, being about like the author's inner self and about our feelings and emotions. That's not necessarily what all poetry is about, by the way, but like that's a perception I think that a lot of people have. And so for you, how do you sort of view the concept of speculative poetry? Like what essentially makes your work speculative poetry?
I have probably an unsatisfying answer for this. I'm going to apologize
Perfect.
in advance. So I always say that like I think Sylvia Plath taught me how to write horror. And I don't think people view her as a horror poet. They view her as a confessional feminist poet. But her work is deeply speculative and deeply horrific. And I think horror itself is subjective, and I think it means something different to everybody. So I think what's horror to me might not be horrifying to somebody else. Somebody might read my work and say, oh, this is a book about postpartum depression. This is like, the Yellow Wallpaper was Charlotte Perkins Gilman writing about postpartum depression. But I mean, it was her experience. So that's a horror. It's a horror story. It's a feminist story. You could look at it in so many different ways. And my writing has always focused on like feminist horror and the feminist experience with like the haunted woman, or like the woman as haunted house, or violence, and women in horror. And so I think sometimes it crosses that line. Like, is this actually the horror, or is this just terrible things happening in real life? And I think that it can be both. So I think it just kind of depends on the reader and the experience that they're bringing. Like Anne Sexton, I think some of her stuff it is horror poetry. Like Edgar Allan Poe is horror in a different way that Sylvia Plath is horror, but they're all still tapping that vein, just in a different way. And I think when we stop trying to like pigeonhole and separate, because I think a lot of times like with literary and genre, that's what we kind of sometimes try to do when we're all kind of dipping into the same pool. We're just calling it something different. You know what I mean? So I don't have a good answer for that. Everything that comes out is dark in one way, shape, or form. Yeah. And I guess it kind of just depends on the reader and where they're connecting with it and where they're drawing that line at that particular time in their life.
It does feel with horror in particular, there's so much wiggle room in that gray area.
Yes.
because I think you're right. Just like what is horrific to you maybe, I mean, I imagine if I was you, some of those things would still be horrific, but they're differently horrific depending on your experience, which
Yeah.
that's actually kind of scary to think about, that horror may not have any kind of stable meaning. It just
Yeah.
shifts from person to person.
Yeah, it's a shapeshifter through and through. Yeah.
Oh, there's a terrifying story in there somewhere. All right, I free the floor. I've asked my. Well, I mean, I will come back later, but like I free the floor from my trying to understand poetry perspective. So
I also have a lot of questions, but I'm also going to immediately pass to Trish because, like, a lot of my excitement is obviously I'm in a room with another poet, and you're saying all of the things that I very strongly attach to. In particular, I love it when speculative poets are able to acknowledge that the things that we consider speculative are things that other poets are constantly doing anyway. Because I appreciate being able to have the conversation, not only as practitioners, but as educators. And at some point, I'm going to come back and ask you some questions about being a teacher as well, about the fact that the things that people find potentially alienating about poetry as a craft in general, and about speculative poetry as a subgenre, are things that people have been playing with for a great long time. Which is why I'm fascinated to hear about your influences and about how personal Blackberries is as a book.
Yeah.
Because it reveals that poetry as a form is like very versatile in that sense, in terms of exploring some of those things. So I guess I'm gonna ask a version of the question everybody else is obviously gonna ask about the book, which is, as you have previously mentioned on the subject of Blackberries, is an intensely personal book, and a book about an intensely personal trauma. Did you feel like visiting it through this particular lens would be potentially um, alienating for some readers, or perhaps even more um, exposing about the nature of postpartum depression, especially for people who have never experienced it before, using that particular horror frame?
Yeah. Well, like I said, this was the first time that I was working on a book that I didn't intend to publish, which in some way was like very freeing, because I was like, oh, well, nobody's going to see this but me. So it doesn't matter what I do. And I wish I could approach everything that I work on with that, because I don't. But this time it was very freeing. But for me, the entire experience was so isolating. And like I said, one of the reasons that I did decide after talking with Jennifer for a very long time to publish it was because I wanted to have that conversation with other women, or at least let them know that it isn't like, it's not just them, and other people go through this, and it's normal and it's common, and and I think for me, even like I've heard from some people, they've shared their experiences with me after reading the book, and it feels so powerful and so validating, because I mean, I don't like to use the word crazy for a lot of reasons, but like I felt like I was going crazy, like truly insane when I was going through postpartum. And when I hear somebody like say like, oh, I went through that, like it's not just you, or I can relate to this so much, or I never saw somebody phrase it like this, and this gives me so much, like it feels good to know that it's not just in your head. And that, like, psychological horror is so terrifying on so many levels. Like when you're looking in a mirror and you don't know if you're staring at yourself, like that's a whole nother level. That's like and it's so hard to describe. So putting it out there was freeing in that way, letting other people read it and respond to it. I guess I wasn't afraid of alienating, because I was just happy that I got through it. And like putting this out there was it felt like such a like champion moment for myself, and like such a survival moment, that like, I mean, it just felt good, honestly. Like if nobody had read it, I mean, obviously like the writer artist part of me would have been crushed, like let's not lie, but like this was a book for me. Like this was something that I needed to do, that I wanted to do. And if it reaches people, that is beyond wonderful. And I hope it does. Because writing it certainly helped and saved me. So, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but it's kind of a
Oh no,
roundabout
yeah, it
response.
definitely
Okay.
does. Like, I'm also like so enamored of like the idea of the book that like forces its way out of you in that sense. The thing that you're
Yes.
working on because you're not thinking about publication, but the act of writing is refreshing for you. In the genre, we don't talk about how often that still happens to people. That people
Mm-hmm.
are writing because the act of writing is somehow cathartic. And I think that it's valuable in particular that, again, especially about something incredibly personal in a way that I cannot physically fathom. Was a part of that process for you, and then you discovered that it was shareable for other people as well.
Yeah. I mean, pregnancy was always like, not that I was like phobic about it, but I was terrified, like from a very young, like
Mhm.
I always flirted with the idea of like whether I wanted children or not. But I was like, the thing that made me like unsure was the act of being pregnant and giving. It was never about whether I felt like I could be a mom or anything like that. Like I was just, the body horror was so scary for me. Um, and I think again, kind of raising, I don't like, raising awareness feels like the wrong turn of phrase for that, but like I think it's good for everybody to read like how much of a change that women really go through during that. Because I think it gets, you watch the Hallmark movies and you see people like it, and it's just, that's not what it is. I mean, I'm sure some people have that experience, and I'm not at all jealous or anything for those people, but it certainly was not mine. And so I think it's good to have uncomfortable, hard conversations, because I think that's when growth and education and all of that comes from. And if nobody's doing it, we can't do better. So I like to think that that's my small, you know, my small place in all of that.
I 100% agree. Because I don't know what it's like to ever be pregnant, and that's probably not gonna happen unless we like get some weird technology from the show Sliders or something. But to me, I think it's really important, even for men, to sort of be aware of like pregnancy is not like just some like casual thing that like, no, it's like a whole like it's a
Yeah.
very life changing, physically changing process, and it can be quite scary. And then it doesn't always end just at the pregnancy bit, because
Yeah.
then you've got this little gremlin that needs food, and then there may be, as you say, postpartum, which I suspect you're also right that people, I don't hear people talk about it that
Mm-mm.
often, and it's probably not as common as like the terror in our mind says, but more common than I think we're comfortable with.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And you have no, I mean, you really, like, I have a wonderfully supportive partner who I felt comfortable talking to about all of this stuff. And like I still like, he still had to go to work, and we still had a newborn baby that needed to be taken care of. So like, regardless of how I felt, I needed to take care of somebody else.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't, it's just, there's such a dichotomy to it. Like you can't take care of yourself because there's no time to take care of yourself, because you have to take care of this small creature who can't do anything.
Yeah.
And then it's like, and then that never stops because you never sleep. It's just this like really terrifying cycle where it's like nothing ever gets solved, and women are just kind of like thrown into that and told good luck. We'll see you at this like at the whatever appointment when you can't even walk and you
Yeah.
have to take a baby to the to the doctor's office. Like it's just, yeah, it was not the fairy tale that I had
No.
seen time and time again, but I'm
This.
still very grateful for everything. And she was my daughter, through all the scary stuff that's like in the book and that we talk about and stuff, like she was the light in all of that. And I think that some people when they read this must think like, oh my God, like what is what is gonna happen when our daughter grows up and like reads this. And I do think about that, but she, like when she would smile or when she would laugh, like she was the best part of everything, and she made everything so unbelievably worth it, no matter how bad.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I think is particularly important about like this book in particular is, you are right in that people don't talk about postpartum as often um, as we perhaps should, but it's also, I think, very noticeably true that the ways in which people who have never experienced postpartum depression talk about it is particularly difficult for mothers who are struggling, because it's often framed as, oh, this mental experience is proof that you are not prepared to be a mother, or that you will be um,
Yeah.
potentially dangerous to your child, or that you do not care about your child. That the fact that you are
Yep.
not having the fairy tale means that you are bad.
Yes.
Um,
Oh my
and
gosh, yes.
and the thing that I think I adore about the collection is that it is revealing, this is very frightening. Please, someone be available for how frightening this is. But it is not because I do not care. It is because I want to care deeply, and something is in the way, and I want to
Yeah.
get past that.
Yeah. Well, it's also like there were times where, and it's something that I still like struggle with, like even now. It's not as bad, but it still creeps up time and time again, where it's like you care so much, like so much, that it's crippling and you can't do anything. Like, I mean, it took me forever to, and I mean, with good reason, because COVID and stuff was still kind of happening. Like, I didn't want my daughter out around people. Like, she couldn't get the vaccine, until, a certain time. She had all kind of hip issues. Like, there were reasons why I wasn't like gallivanting out into the world. But even when I could, I was terrified of everything. I was terrified of germs. I was terrified of like myself. Like, she's so small and so fragile. Like, can I take her? Like, can I take her to a bookstore? Can I take her to like, can she socialize with people? What if somebody hurts her? What if somebody, like, it just, the intrusive thinking was so loud that it was like I sat on a couch and like didn't move for like 6 months out of fear. And I think like that's the other part of like postpartum that kind of isn't really talked about, where it's like you're so protective and you're so terrified. Like, it's not necessarily like the ghost and the mother that's going to hurt their child or something like that version of it, but there's this other side too that's equally as terrifying, because you're crippled and you can't move. And that's a very scary place to exist in as well. I'm really just bringing all the happy vibes. I'm so sorry.
I'm glad we're talking about it though.
Every time somebody invites me on a podcast, I'm like, I'm so sorry. Are you sure? Sure you want me?
I think it's important though. Like, not all art is going to be about happy things.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's about very difficult subjects, and that is, that is part of the process for how humans sometimes deal with these things, is to express it through art. And I think it's important we talk about it. It doesn't mean like every conversation we have with you is going to be about this, right?
No, no, I promise.
No, but like this one, it makes sense. It's the book, and this is so much a part of the experience of the book. So I am very glad we're talking about it, because I think it's informative to have sort of honest conversations about these very difficult things that, frankly, I hear almost nobody talk about. And yeah.
We can pivot slightly, though, just to give a little bit of a mental break. I wanted to ask you a few things about the craft of writing poetry. So on my first look at the subject of Blackberries, I just skipped ahead to the first poem, and I could tell that it was very powerful, but I could also tell that I was missing a lot of undercurrents and things. So then I went back and read the author's note and the witchcraft of writing, and then I read the first chapter of Shirley Jackson's We've Always Lived in the Castle, which was the sample that Libby gave me. The waiting list for the book was 20 weeks, so that was all that I read of that. But anyway, after that, I felt a lot better prepared to try to appreciate the depth of your poetry, and I wanted to ask you, how important do you think it is that people come into your poetry with sufficient context? What would you consider sufficient context? And also, just for poetry in general, how much do you think context is important for trying to understand and appreciate it.
Yeah, so for this one specifically, I think you can certainly read it without having read We Have Always Lived in the Castle. I think it'll feel like a very dark, maybe at times incoherent fever dream, which is what the experience felt like. So honestly, when people say that to me, I'm like, yeah, like I understand. Like, this is not the insult that you think it is. That's exactly what I'm going for. So I do think that you can experience the book that way. And I think obviously if you know you've gone through certain similar experiences, you might be able to connect with it on a level that maybe somebody who hasn't been through that can't. But I do think in like the broader scape, if you're familiar with Jackson's work and specifically that novel, I think this opens up a whole other world for what you can take from this and kind of see how I've kind of made myself my own character and inserted myself into this world that is, you know, we have always lived in the castle, but also very much isn't. It's like the garden outside of the Blackwood property that like the girl looks at like, oh, these girls are cool, I want to be their friends, but I'm afraid and I'm going to stay on my side of the fence type of a deal. But my other work, not necessarily so much. I don't think there are certain books or certain authors, but I do like all of my books are thematically orchestrated. So I think with certain themes like hysteria, I think if you've read a lot of like mental health horror and psychological horror and you've watched, you know, The Ward and Session 9 and you know you're into like Shutter Island and all of that stuff, you're going to get something out of that book because I'm dealing with tropes and I'm pulling from a lot of like the classic horror stuff that I love about that topic. So, you know, I kind of weave it in there. So I like to think that a lot of my poetry is really like love letters to genre and the stuff that I've connected with deeply. But my later work, Blackberries and some of like the fiction that's like come out around like 2022 and moving forward is very like folk horror and witch centric. So I think on some level, some of the like the botany or some of the like ritual stuff like that, if you're unfamiliar with folk horror specifically or the archetype of the witch, I think maybe in that respect there might be a layer that gets missed just because I'm like my COVID like coping thing was I got really into like flowers and herbs. I'm not like sure where it came from because I kill everything I grow. But like I was determined and like I started reading all of these like occult botany books and I just like super geeked out. And so I feel like so much of that, you know, including Blackberry magic is like weaving itself into my work in like weird ways that people are probably like, okay, like Wytovich is really she's like going on a weird level now that I don't know if we should touch, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah, just touching on that, I love the illustrations throughout the book, the old-fashioned line drawings, and they're just lovely and lush. Were those all done after the book? Did you have any idea what any of that was going to be like, or were you kind of conceptualizing as you went?
No, so this is one of those like rare moments of like I feel like really like special friendship because so Jennifer and I have been working together for 10 plus years and she's been my editor for all of my work with Raw Dog and you know, I think we've really gotten to know each other so well, especially like through her editing my work. I feel like she understands me for better or worse better than most people do. And so when I had sent her the manuscript, she had mentioned that she wanted to design the cover and that she wanted to put some images in, and I just kind of gave her free reign. And so I had no idea what she was picking or why she was picking it. And so when she sent me the you know, the interior layout and I saw everything, it was this like it felt like, you know, you had like a true reader who over the years just understood what all of these symbols mean to you. And like I would see like, you know, certain flowers or certain images and like teacups, and I'm like, she gets me. Like, she gets this work. She knew that the etchings would be like right up my alley for this, and it was just like, it felt like kismet. Like, I don't think anybody else but Jennifer could have like handled this and made such a beautiful package to kind of honor not only my work but my experience and kind of what this book meant. So I just feel very, very lucky and very grateful for her for doing that.
Mm-hmm. One more question about influences. Obviously, you've listed several that you were feeling. I had thought, of course, while I was reading it, of Plath's Ariel collection and the Yellow Wallpaper. I was also thinking about Warren Zevon's song, Ain't That Pretty at All, you know. So I'll hurl myself against the wall because I'd rather feel bad than not feel anything at all. Yep. Obviously you're talking sort of backward to the influence that you've had. And I wondered about, how you view yourself as being in conversation, in an ongoing conversation with past and present writers and future.
Yeah, I'm really trying to kind of subvert this idea of like the American female Gothic, is I guess kind of how I like to frame it, because and it's frustrating because I love the like intense swooning Gothic tropes of like women in the white dresses on the moors, like being taken away to a castle, and is it a ghost, is it my husband, I don't know, like I love that. Like, I'm not going to pretend that I don't, but I also want to try to kind of rewrite that script a little bit in a more contemporary lens to handle some of these issues that we're seeing politically and socially and stuff like that. So that's, I guess, it's at the same time like paying homage to it, but also trying to subvert it at the same time. Which is why I really I loved Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno Garcia. Like, I read that and I was like, I got my castle, I got my girls in the dresses, I got it was beautiful. It was everything I wanted. And like, I read and I've taught Sisters by Daisy Johnson, which is this beautiful stream of conscious novel that has multiple POVs, and it'll just gut you. It's just gut-wrenchingly atrocious. But the way it talks about madness and grief, it just it's nice to be believed as a woman, and I want to kind of bring that to horror, because I mean, that's the trope with the Gothic, right? The woman goes to the house, she starts seeing ghosts, she tells everybody, and they're like, okay, you're crazy, go lay down. And then the ghosts ruin everybody's life, and she's usually the only one that makes it out, or she dies and she's stuck in the house and she becomes the ghost that the next woman sees. It's it's very repetitive. So I like thinking about what happens when they are believed, and where do we go after that? How does the woman save herself? And so that's kind of what I like playing with this, especially as, from a confessional poet point of view, because I think Plath and Sexton both really, really tried, and were screaming in their poetry and weren't able ultimately to save themselves. And so I take that very seriously, and I really want to try to give that help or give that voice to myself and to the characters that I'm writing about. So,
So somewhat related to this, but less literary reference that I was thinking of, I kept snapping on to lines in the book that to me seem to be referencing other traumatic issues that typically face women, not just the central subject we've talked about a lot today. And I had a different one, but then I scrolled through the book a little earlier today and found a completely different one than the one I had planned for when we had to reschedule. So which just leapt out to me because I was reading about court cases earlier today, and I was like, oh boy. And then this line just hit me like a ton of bricks, which is, such passion in scenes of rude questioning on witness stands made of tragedy, which just immediately made me think of just every situation where a woman is not believed on in any court scenario where she's subjected to, really invasive and cruel questions, and regardless of whatever the criminal act that is being adjudicated that day. And so it made me think about, overall, this book seems at times to sort of reference these other concerns that affect women. And I guess the personal nature of this works, I guess, did you kind of see this collection speaking also to sort of those generations of women's trauma? That sounds like a lofty statement, but like, did you kind of see yourself deliberately poking out to all of these other concerns as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It was always baffling to me, like with that line specifically, like the questions people just felt so comfortable asking me. And like, I think like so much of it, I was constantly in shock because like I was seeing a therapist and like I had a psychiatrist and I had a really good support team, and I still have a really great support team. But yet outside of that network, like it was like people just thought I was crazy, and they would ask me questions, and it was like I either had to lie or I couldn't tell the complete truth because I knew that it was going to get fabricated. And like I knew my therapist understood where I was, I knew my psychiatrist understood where I was, but my PCP wasn't on board with, like, it was just this, it was really scary, and you didn't know who you could trust.
Mm.
And it really made me think of like the yellow wallpaper again, when she's like, hey, Jonathan, this isn't doing well. And he's like, shut up, I'm your doctor. I know it's best, go lay down. And it felt very alienating. So I think like issues even just with like women feeling comfortable talking to their doctors and advocating for themselves, and like just being believed in so many different facets of life. Like it's so scary to know who's looking out for you in your best interest, who's not going to turn something that you say into like this next horrible thing or misconstrue your words. And like it felt very scary, and at times it still kind of does. But when I got diagnosed with OCD, which in a way was like a very weird godsend, because I thought like, but like, listen, so for I thought that I had all of these like adorable, quirky, like eccentric things that made me weird. And then when I found out that they're actually because of OCD, I was like, oh, okay. Like so much about my life, like was like, this is why that happened. And it like just made sense. And then I was able to figure out how to deal with them, where I never had that before. But when I look at my grandparents, my grandmothers, and like my dad's side of the family, like I see those same things in the Wytovich side that were never addressed. And so I sit there and I'm like, I wonder if my grandmothers or my grandfather or my dad, like, I wonder if they would have talked about this, if that would have helped them. And then it would have gotten like, maybe it would have still genetically, like we would have been predisposed to certain things, but they might have not been this like Herculean thing that we all have to deal with in order to like get out of the house or leave a room, things like that. So I do think that there is that, like you said, this like generational kind of focus in the work, because I mean, mental health is better now than it was, all these years ago, but we have a lot of work to do, like a lot of work to do. And I think it's important to talk about that and point out where we're failing as much as where we're succeeding.
Yeah, it's sort of like the idea that hysteria was the special designation for women who were exhibiting any non-normal, and I'm putting scare quotes around it, non-normal behavior that women are expected to adhere to. Where it's like, but some of those women are just they're suffering from something legitimate, and you just like, nope, you're just hysterical. Or even sometimes the opposite. They're not actually suffering from anything. They've experienced a trauma. Well, I guess that's a suffering, but a different kind of thing. And you're now being dismissed as, well, you're just mentally deranged.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know like there were so many, like everybody kept asking me like, well, after birth, most women go through some type of like baby blues, is what everybody kept calling it. And I was like, I get that, but that's not what this is. Like, I'm not like sad that I'm not pregnant anymore. Like I'm having PTSD from my birth. I'm having like this is not like an acute sadness. Like this is something that's scary and I
Yeah.
need you to listen to that. And again, it was just, I can't tell you how many surveys I filled out like where I was asking for help and I was either like dismissed or I was just given to the next person and I was like I'm just going to I'm going to go in my office and I'm going to just write poetry because I'm the only one that's listening to myself.
Mm.
And I know I'll listen to myself. So I guess that's what I got.
Unfortunately,
Yeah.
I have heard this from so many women about how the medical system has treated their concerns. I know people who've got like fibromyalgia and it takes them like years to get doctors to like sit down and take it seriously. They're like, nah, you just having like PMS, like, or whatever. And it's like that's not helpful.
Yeah.
There may be something else going on. And I know that historically, we're behind. We're still behind on like women's medical health because we've like only started taking it seriously like what, maybe the last 40 years question mark. Yeah. And it seems absurd to me because like half your population are women and you're like, we're not going to take that part seriously. But like, even if you only think of women in really kind of degrading ways, it's like they're still like kind of essential for the species. So like
a little bit. Yeah.
Like you would think you'd take that like, it's weird to me. Okay. This is a bizarre, I'm sorry. I have to say this, but like, men historically have taken cows more seriously than their wives.
Yeah.
That's insane. Yeah. That's bananas to me. Like, they know everything about a cow, like the ins and outs. Oh, that cow hoof, like, that it's got sclubahism, right? Because that cow hoof's, like, slightly off tinge and, like, but they won't know anything about their wives historically. Like, that's bananas, guys. Come on.
Yeah.
Ugh. Anyway, sorry, I have a rant. There's a rant in there, like women's work and like how we don't take it seriously. Like it just drives me nuts. Like I'm not here without my mom. Don't know what to tell you. For many different reasons, just to be clear, not just the birthing part.
I'm here for this rant. I love it.
Sorry, like no, I maybe shouldn't be the one giving it.
I am super here for it. Please. Yes.
At some point in the future, for the rant's own sake, we will have this conversation. So I would like to divert from all of this. Oh God. To talk more about the craft of poetry and your advocacy of it, not only as a practitioner but as an educator. You are an adjunct professor of creative writing in 3 different universities, and you're also the editor of Writing Poetry in the Dark, which I think is particularly spectacular because, if I'm not mistaken, it may be the only craft text for writing speculative poetry that has ever been written.
Yes.
And I have a lot of feelings about that because you're actually working in academia. I'm sure you have had the struggle of having conversations with people who, because they don't write or read poetry very often, think that writing and reading poetry is particularly dense or difficult or challenging. No, I am not judging you, Sean. I'm just pointing out that this is a thing that people do on a regular basis.
This is definitely about me right now.
But even more so when you break that down further into speculative poetry, they see that as even further challenging because either it is this simple kind of pulp thing that is not as deep or critical as literary poetry, or it has the potential to be that deep, but as a result becomes harder to write. And I was actually kind of curious, in your position as an academic, but also having edited this collection, Writing Poetry in the Dark, how do you feel about the act of championing writing poetry and especially speculative poetry to people who think that it is a struggle?
Yeah, so I feel so intensely passionate about this because So when I was younger, like I gravitated towards poetry and I read it like voraciously. I absolutely loved like the musicality of it, the connection, the way that images were built. Like I just thought it was absolutely amazing. And then I got to high school and then I started being taught poetry and I was like, absolutely not. Like I hated it. I like hate is a strong. I was frustrated because I all of a sudden had people telling me what was and was not poetry and that there was a right way to write it. And I just so strongly don't agree with that sentiment. And I think that that's why so many of us don't like poetry is because we had a bad experience it when we were in K through 12 and somebody frustrated us or made us write too many sonnets or made us count out iambic pentameter too many times that we were like, screw this. I never want to read another poem again. Like Shakespeare has killed it for me, or, I don't want to talk about the Raven anymore. Like we just had a bad experience. And that kind of shaped our view of what the poem was. And when I was in college, then I started writing again. I was writing for myself. Like when I was younger, when I was in middle school, I started writing poetry because my therapist at the time had recommended it. I was having a really hard time talking about stuff. I was like just essentially being silent in our sessions. And she was like, if you're having a hard time talking to me, you should talk to yourself. And my God, if that didn't just shape my whole damn career. But so when I was in college, I didn't even know that speculative poetry was a thing. But I knew that I liked writing about monsters and I knew that I loved horror. And so I put monsters and I put horror and I started writing these like small, I kind of think of them as like just like Polaroid pictures, kind of as like these little poems and these worlds that I would build. And when I started sharing with them and talking to my teachers about it, they were like, oh, yeah, like this is totally a thing. And you can see it all throughout history, but we just call it something different. Or it's not looked at as speculative poetry. It's not called horror poetry. That's what it is. But because I was essentially raised by horror writers in undergrad and grad school. So I was very lucky in that respect. But my mentor also was a horror poet. So Michael Arnzen was my mentor in undergrad and then very close friend and colleague and teacher and stuff in grad school. And, he's written horror poetry for years. And so he kind of took me under his wing and was showing me like, these are contemporary horror poets. This is stuff that you can learn. This is classic stuff that you can read and see how you can, merge it with some of your favorite tropes and stuff today. And it just kind of it opened up all of this possibility that I thought was dead. Like I really I didn't think that you could do this. And when I realized that like kind of like what I was saying about horror, like poetry is subjective. Like who is to tell somebody what is and isn't a poem? Like I think when you're writing formalist poetry, like, yeah, you can be critiqued on whether you're hitting the certain notes and doing stuff like that. And form exists for a reason. And I've been writing form poetry and stuff recently because I've been trying to push myself out of my comfort zone and I'm having a blast with it. But that's not the only way to write poetry. And I think when you start telling kids that, like when I tell my students that, and I'm like, take the pressure off and just have fun and just write. Like, what's your favorite monster movie? Write a poem about that. What is the thing that you're most afraid of? Write about like, and kind of do these stream of conscious exercise. Or sometimes I'll take my tarot cards to class and I'll have students pull cards and then they write to that. And like, when they see it doesn't have to be this strenuous by the book thing, like all of the fun creeps back into writing and they start letting themselves explore. And I feel like that's the part that we've been missing with poetry for so long because we're so caught up on if it's not this like highbrow academic thing that it's not real. And there's just so much room for all different types of poetry. And like that's kind of what I want to start like injecting back into like the curriculum and the syllabus to get people excited about it again. Because if not, like it is going to die. So we have to start, I mean, we have to show like more passion and curiosity and all of this stuff for the poem and what it can be, not just what it was, X number of years ago.
I dig this so much. I have so many feelings. I'm very sorry. Um, I just like you are correct in that a lot of the things that kind of like condition us out of this enjoyment of poetry are things that happen when we're very young because we're taught that it's supposed to work a certain way and it's supposed to be quote unquote right.
Yeah.
And I guess part of the reason why I like speculative poetry in particular is because as a subgenre your attachment to all of the things that have happened in science fiction and fantasy and horror gives you this like broad palette of other things that you could be doing or referencing that are no by no means less serious and
Right.
very often even more like intensely political by its framing,
Hmm.
but you also get to just have fun and write a thing that is weird
Yes.
because you know that it is weird. And I'm very like, part of me wants to just like, like ask the idle question, like, what is the thing that you do in your classes to just get people who have never written poetry before to be excited about writing their first
Oh,
poem?
oh, my students get so I do this exercise and I've had students like on the assessment who are like, I hate this so much and I hate you for doing this so much, but like, okay, it worked. But it like, so the one day I walked into class and I said that so it was a prose poetry course. And I was like, I want you to write me a prose poem about what you think prose poetry is. And that was the assignment. And like everybody was like, what does that mean? And I was like, I don't know, guess you're gonna have to figure it out. And it was like, when you're not given direction, what do you come up with? And that was the real like that was what I wanted them to do, was like just make something, like put your own spin on it. Don't worry about what the rubric is. Don't worry about how I'm grading you. Don't worry, like just do it. And that was probably one of the harder things that I've asked my students to do, because it really is like you have to trust yourself, you have to go on your gut, you have to trust your like and just make something. And I think a lot of people are afraid of doing that. And I think once we get over that hurdle and they're like, oh, okay, I see what we're doing here, then it opens the door a little bit and they start getting curious and creeping through and like, okay, well, if she let me get away with that, maybe I can do this time, and maybe I can try that. And like it's freedom to experiment in a way. And I I love that. And I wish I had gotten more of that. So I try to like kind of bring that chaotic, structured approach to my classroom, I guess, to inspire everybody to just trust themselves with their art.
Yeah, I love that a lot. I just I want people to write more poetry. You know, that's just that my thing. I was writing
Yes.
since I was very young. I was working professionally as a poet while I was still in when I just came out of high school.
Yes.
Um, and I'm just like I am enamored by other people's attempts to remind people that it is as easy to become a poet as it is to write anything else. Um,
Yes.
and I just admire that you are doing so much academia, like 3 schools, Jesus Christ.
Thank you.
But yeah, I have a lot of feelings about the work that you do. I think it's really
Oh,
rad to
thank you.
inspire more people to write, especially speculative poetry. Especially because the genre landscape, while I'm very glad that speculative poetry is genuinely being more recognized, I'm
Yep.
glad that the SFPA is doing as much work as possible to um, elevate poetry as an art form. I'm grateful that other communities like the Horror Writers Association value poetry equally to
Yes.
prose, but it does still feel very often like this is still like a niche within wider genre. There's a large community that don't read or know that they can easily find and read speculative poetry. A great deal of the markets that were previously open specifically for speculative poetry are often the ones that are closing the fastest.
Yeah.
So knowing that somebody is still like actively going out of their way to make that more available, especially for people who are not already deeply entrenched in genre, is actually very valuable to me.
Thank you so very much. That means a lot, because something that because I always had a lot of my grad students would ask for a speculative craft book on poetry, and I never had any that I could offer them. And I mean, I could recommend craft books on poetry, all day long. And I, certain ones I'm like, okay, well, this was written by a speculative prose writer, but they do some poetry, and I would kind of wiggle it. And then finally I was like, I'm getting sick of saying I don't have an answer. And so I'm just I'm gonna do it. And that was one of my big writer bucket list things, was I wanted to start, I wanted to contribute something nonfiction in a big way that wasn't like, you don't have to go to college to learn how to do, there are books that you can read and it's more accessible. And I really wanted something out there for people to, like you said, to pique people's interest and be like, oh, okay, so these are people who write it. These are people I could read. I could go to their backlog. I could study. I really wanted something to try to save it and, champion it and stuff. So that really means a lot. Thank you so very much for saying that.
Thank you for editing the book in the first place.
So I think it's time. We have to wrap up. Because I think we've hit more questions than we originally had written down by a mile. And I think we can't keep Stephanie here forever. Because we're nice.
I mean, we can. We shouldn't. But we can.
We're
to
nice,
be clear,
Brandon.
yes, we're nice.
Yeah. So, to take us to our closeout, I'll start with the first, most obvious question. What are you working on next?
So I have kind of a weird, bizarre little novella that I'm working on that, again, is so out of my comfort zone that like it's cosmic horror, it's psychological, it does a lot of things that are very, I think, will really surprise people if my name is attached to it, which has some nerves, in and of itself. But so I'm working on playing with that. I am working on another poetry collection that is very folk horror, very maybe more stereotypical horror witch based. It's very dark, kind of Hansel and Gretel, don't go into the woods, what happens when you do go into the woods. So I'm pulling from a lot of fairy tales and stuff like that, which is very exciting, especially because I'm teaching a lot of Angela Carter right now, so it's very much on my mind. And then my hope is to work on the sequel to Writing Poetry in the Dark soon. So once I wrap up some stuff, I want to dive into that, because I have a cool idea for how I want to approach the next book. And I've thrown out some feelers to some people who are interested in participating it. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Nice.
Yes.
The people who are listening to the podcast cannot notice that I was just vigorously pointing at myself. So yes.
I love it. Yes.
And if folks would like to find you and your work, where might they go?
So I'm still hanging out on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it now.
Shitter.
Stephanie.
We call it Shitter.
Yeah. I'm still there for the time being, although I feel like my time is waning there. I'm on Instagram at Wytovich. I also have a Bookstagram account called The Haunted Bookshelf, where it's strictly horror-based stuff that I'm reading and teaching. And then I have a Substack, which is where I do my monthly newsletter. I talk craft. In the new year, I'm going to have separate threads on my Substack, or one that's strictly devoted to witchcraft and the other that's strictly devoted to thanatology and all of the work that I do with studying death and death rituals and stuff like that across cultures. So I'm planning on doing a lot of cool stuff with my Substack soon. And then I have my website as well, stephaniemwytovich.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, for being on today's show. We really appreciate it.
This was a blast. Thank you so very much for having me.
You're most welcome. All right, for folks at home, that's the show. So if you, again, want to let us know what you thought, or you've written some poetry yourself and you'd like to tell us about it, we'd love to hear about it. There is a lovely place you can send that information. It's skiffyfanty.com/listener suggestions. We're Skiffy and Fanty on pretty much every social network, although we're in the same boat you are in, Stephanie, which is how much longer are we on Shitter at this moment? Not much longer. But if you'd like to find all of our links and all of our social accounts, we're in Mastodon and Blue Sky, etc. That is linktr.ee/skiffyandfanty, Linktree. So please go there. We also have a newsletter, which you can get via that same link. And if you like the show, we have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/skiffyandfanty. And you can give us all your money because we like money. I mean, yeah, I don't know what else to tell you. Money's good. So, for me, I'm at SeanDuke.net. Alphabet streams on Twitch Tuesdays, Thursdays at 7, and every other Saturday, except during the month of December, because I will be in another country, and I don't know if I'll stream. And I also have a link tree, which is just /SeanDuke or /SeanDuke, whichever. You can go whichever one makes you happy. And I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram and all of those places, but you can find them there.
You can find me, Brandon O'Brien, on almost all social media at The Rising Tides. I have a newsletter, which is also my website at brandonobrien.xyz, and I'm also at speculatorsf.com.
And you can find me on Blue Sky at P.E. Matson, on Mastodon, at newsy.social at TrishEM, and at my blog, whatsthewordnow.blogspot.com.
Perfect. Okay, I gotta make it awkward because it's required by the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws. And I was gonna read a poem I wrote, but I can't find it, so I don't think I'll do that.
So you must. The one time I wanted to make it awkward.
Let me find this. I just went to my old Tumblr.
Just come up with something on the spot.
Oh gosh.
No, I can't do that. I wrote a haiku at some point. Where's my haiku? Let me find my haiku.
It's a Tumblr generation poem, which means that
I'm
it's
so
definitely. I
excited.
am very excited for this.
No,
I can't wait.
This is an old poem. Let me find my. Hold on, give me a second, y'all.
If this is a pre-Yahoo Tumblr poem, it's golden.
Oh.
I'll find it. Don't worry. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know what date this was written. Oh, 2013. Because I did NaPoWriMo, so you're just gonna have to deal with this. I don't even know the context for this haiku.
Let it fly.
Yes, please.
In Gulf Coast summers, the streets run as swift rivers fleeing the coming storm.
What are you? Yeah, that's amazing.
That was dope.
I wrote a bunch of haikus. Hold on.
Yes.
I did another one. A tree sways above, tender branches protecting. It is not voiceless. I don't even know what that means.
That's beautiful.
That was actually very lovely. Sean,
I'll send you a link, Brandon.
Yes,
That's
please.
philosophical. Yeah.
Is it?
I'm mad that I didn't know that you had written these before. I'm literally upset.
I have a poem called The Thermodynamics of Children.
And I want to read it.
Yeah. You can't throw that title out and not read it.
I don't even know what this poem's about. What is this about? Oh no, it's definitely me having a never-ending story moment again. That's what this is about.
I am excited to discover all of these things now, Sean. Look what you have done.
I will send it. I will send it to people later.
Yes,
but I'm not reading this one. It's too long. I'm sorry, guys.
Fair.
On that note, awkward ending and see. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/skiffyandfanty or skiffyandfanty.com, our website, where you can get access to all of our fancy things. Our music comes from Holy Mole. You can support him and his work at patreon.com/holymole. Thank you for listening.